Well, hello, a very good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where in the world you are tuning in from. My name is Adrian Reed, and a very warm welcome to today's BA Community webinar. Now, this is certainly one of the most popular topics for a long time. Perhaps you're tuning in because you're working in an agile, some sort of agile project or agile method. Maybe you're an experienced agile practitioner and you're looking for a different perspective. Just before we get started, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about Lynn and Simon. You've probably seen their work before, but Lynn is a business consultant, trainer, coach, author, and practitioner. Her particular strength is in applying an agile mindset and concepts outside of software development to help organizations become adaptive. Simon is an experienced agile coach with over 20 years experience as a practitioner and agile leader, working mainly in the public sector. So with 20 years experience, Simon, I'm guessing that's straight from school. So we'll be hearing more from Simon and Lynn about the topic of Agile. Please do remember, if you're tuned in live, you can ask questions as we go along. So there's the chat button for chatting to other people who are on the session. But if you ask a question in the Q&A panel, we will cover as many of those as we can as we go through as well. Just before we get started, though, I wanted to just let you know that there is a mural board open for this session. I will just explain how that will work. So let me just get my screen open for you. And I'll also just be putting the link to the mural in the chat now for those of you that are attending live. So let me just pop that link in the chat. And I will share my screen and show you how this will work. So you'll see here there's a mural board. I see some of you joining it already. If you've been on one of these webinars before, you'll be familiar with the format. Essentially, there's a shared canvas with which you can do what you want. What I would suggest is that if you hear something that particularly resonates with you, you just double click and add your takeaway, the point that you want to record. You could get even more creative if you like. You can add images and shapes and all sorts of stuff over here. And what I'll do at the end of the session is I will share a PDF of that on LinkedIn. So it's a great way of it's a great way of sharing the takeaways with people who can't be here live. So let's kick off. So Lynn and Simon, before we get too far into the conversation, I suppose it's worth sort of talking about definitions in the very beginning, because of course the title of the book that you wrote very recently was Agile from First Principles, and people use that term agile a lot. But what does it mean to you? How would you go about defining agile? There, a really simple one to start with.
You say it's simple, and it sort of is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so the Agile Manifesto, 68 words. There's another, I think, 186 that are the Agile principles. But in the book, we talk about it and I counted them last night, 55 pages. So it really, for us, Agile is something that on the surface of it is simple. But as soon as you delve into it, every single word actually has a whole world of confusion and complexity and sometimes pain surrounding it, which means that Agile turns out to be really difficult to do well. So that's kind of my first kind of point on it. It should be simpler than it is, but in reality, it's not.
I'll add to that, because Agile really isn't about, I think too many people focus on Agile as a set of processes and tools. And I think Agile really is about behavior and mindset. And I think we've tried to labor that in the book, and as we go through a lot of the principles, although you can say there are, the 4 Agile Manifesto statements and there are 12 principles, actually unpacking those and understanding about the behaviors and the mindsets needed covers a multitude of things. I mean, even just on the leadership chapter itself, that could be reams of books. So it's more about behavior and mindset than it is about following a process. And I think it doesn't, then this is where our perspectives, I guess, change and are slightly different. Like from my perspective, that agile mindset and behavior can be applied to anything, not just software, but it's absolutely needed in the software world. And that's where it came from. We can't forget that agile was a movement towards making software better. So it really does come down to a lot of that.
And one of the things that we did was we tried to work out what are those common factors, those common kind of principles. And we pulled out 7 of them, which are kind of spread through the principles and kind of present in almost any agile framework that you see. So it's things like empiricism, it's things like the pillars of transparency, inspection, adaptation, that whole continuous improvement and seeking to simplify that's really important, the whole lean movement, eliminating waste. Of course, there's the incremental and iterative delivery, which is something that, again, is quite challenging to do in practice. The focus on customers and their feedback being really, really important, and that feedback being handled in a kind of honest way, whereas often we kind of couch feedback in negative terms when it's associated with other things. And then finally, the teams. The thing that Agile talks about repeatedly is self-organized, empowered teams that, again, sound simple, but aren't so easy in practice.
It's really interesting, isn't it? And certainly the self-organizing teams. I mean, we could probably do a good hour or 2-hour conversation just on that one topic. But as you were both talking there, one thing that was striking me was I'll be interesting to see your perspective on this, but it strikes me that there's a difference between an organization having agility, as in the ability to respond to its environment. And you mentioned feedback there, Simon, and I was imagining, the environment is giving an organization feedback all the time. It just normally, most organizations don't listen to that feedback. But then the organization's got to be wired metaphorically to respond to that feedback. But when most people say agile, what they're talking about is almost, and I can't think of a better way of describing it than this, but like the engine room of agile, as in the delivery engine for a product or software. So is your view similar, that actually, yes, like the agile methods are important, but they're not enough? You need that whole cross-organizational shift in the way the organization is wired and thinks. Would that also be your view?
I definitely agree with that. As you know, the topic of business agility is very close to my heart. Maybe that's the next book. I'm not quite sure. But,
yes, please.
But I think that if everyone in an organization has the agile mindset and they have agile behaviors, then you will have an agile organization. I think the reason we talk about all of these things so much is because product and service teams, which is where agility methods tend to focus, is on the product team or the service team, tend to be constrained by the environment in which they sit. And the environment in which they sit, is they don't have the responsibility, or they don't have the ability to influence things like the policies, the governance, the structure of the organization. And those are the things that constrain how well they can deliver their products and services, which is quite ironic, really, because the products and services is a thing that the organization sells to make it profitable.
Yes.
So you've got to look at the whole thing. And I think that's where the agile movement's going now. So I think that's why we put a little bit about scaling. We talked a little bit about it at the end, but that's where it's going. It's not just good enough to have teams that are really good at firing out new technology and new services, because if you don't have all of those other things in place, it still won't be successful, because you're being hampered by the environment by which they sit.
And like Lynn said earlier, and in fact, David said in the chat, it's a mindset. You can pretend to do Scrum and not be agile. You can have the poster manifesto, or the manifesto on a poster behind you, and you can not be agile. And you can be having a set of behaviors that make you very agile without even realizing agile and agility is a thing. And that's why it's those kind of core things we just talked about that are really important, that self-organization, the empowerment, the customer centricity, the iterative delivery of value. Now, things like Scrum and most of the other agile frameworks can help you do that, and they're really good start points, are really good stabilizers or scaffolding for you. But fundamentally, you've got to behave in a different way and believe in different things. And it is a proper, I think, paradigm shift. You've got to think differently, think about your requirements differently, think about your customers differently, think about your architecture differently, your evolution of your product differently. And that's where the power is. It's in that different thinking.
I guess if you're a startup and you're a small company, you've got one development team, you've got one customer, and that's where you start, it's easier to get it right from the start.
Yeah.
I think for many organizations, they've got a lot of legacy of which to change. And that's where it becomes even more difficult and even more constrained, because you've got people that have been brought up on management theories and management thinking and behavior that is not compatible with agile ways of working. And that's what you're tackling in organizations. It's generally not the development teams that are the people that can't adapt. It's generally the externals around that.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And people have been used to that way of working, and actually most organizations reward it. I mean, a lot of organizations reward really risk-averse behavior. And there's an old expression that we probably all heard. If you think about a big IT company that we're all aware of, there's no one ever got sacked for buying that big IT company's stuff, so you get that kind of thing going on. So let's talk a little bit about perhaps some misconceptions. And in fact, we've got a really, really interesting question coming from Elizaveta. And Elizaveta asks, how do you explain that Agile does not mean that there shall be no written requirements? And this is the sort of the gift that keeps on giving, isn't it?
Yeah,
where
it is.
there's should there be a BA in Agile? Does Agile mean there's no requirements? I mean, how would you answer that question?
So it's not true, for a start.
Yes.
There should always be written documentation. I think there's a historical thing here. When the Agile movement came in, I think there were a lot of business analysts that have been brought up on what we call structured system analysis and design methodology, which is
SSADM.
SSADM, fantastic methodology. But the concept of SSADM and some of the principles and practices that were in there was about documenting the requirements, and those requirements turn into the documentation for the product or the service. So it forced and it sort of exacerbated that upfront requirement stuff. I don't think in Agile we need that anymore, but we need to maintain that, we need to understand the context by which we're operating, the context of the product or service that we're delivering. You can't just write, you can't go write 2000. In fact, I went to a conference once where it said being Agile with a backlog of 54,000 requirements. And I was like, yeah, that's sort of not very Agile. and I think, so you can't write 2000 stories in a backlog and say that's what we're building, because there's no context around that. So you've got to have this, it's got to be an evolution. So it's about collaboration. It's about just in time, just enough. We do need business analysis in there. But again, this comes back to, if you're looking at Scrum and you're looking at one methodology, and Scrum is only one methodology of many, and actually Scrum embraces a lot of the Agile concepts and methodologies. When you're talking about one team, one product, one customer, if it's all straightforward and there's not a lot of complexity and there's not a lot of dependencies around that, then I think you can do that quite successfully with somebody who's got business analysis skill sets, but maybe isn't a specialist business analyst.
Yes.
The minute that complexity comes in and there's multiple teams and there's lots of dependencies and there's more complexity and it's a bit more complicated, then I think you do need specialists, but you need specialists in every area. Scrum doesn't talk about testers, but you need specialist testers in that environment. Scrum doesn't talk about designers, but you'll need specialists that can do that designing around some of the technology. So business analysis isn't the only thing that it doesn't mention. And I think we put too much focus on Scrum and not enough on what we're trying to do with the Agile context, if you like.
Absolutely. And that kind of brings me back, Lynn, to something you both mentioned earlier, which is, it's about that broader agility, and not all Agile is Scrum. Not all Agile is Scrum. So we've got quite a few questions coming in, which is always good to see. So we'll cover as many of these as we can. So Sarah asks, can ITIL, TOGAF, Waterfall, and Agile all function together in a single company? If so, how? If you can answer that one, you're going to be a millionaire. And the next bit's probably a perhaps easier one to answer. And what are the major challenges?
Well, mapping all of those methods together.
But
I'll let Simon answer that one.
Oh, well dodged.
Yeah, I think actually, funny enough, the answer I think is going to be similar to what I would have answered to that previous question about the documentation question. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about documentation comes from a historic position where once you write something down and sign it off, that's it, fixed, cast in stone, has to be done. And a lot of those methodologies, TOGAF and system engineering V model, the passing down of commissioning requirements, the establishment of ITIL, none of those things are cast in stone, and none of those things can't be changed after you've written them the first time. And if you bring into any of those frameworks the notion that things change, we want to be able to respond to change, and respond to change doesn't mean reacting when it happens. It means anticipating it, it means looking for it, and it means not being surprised or annoyed when it happens, but being able to respond. I think that's the secret to getting these things aligned and working together. And it's back to the kind of core values of talking to the right people, of responding to change, of valuing collaboration between the different disciplines and the different experts across those different areas, and about focusing on what the customer needs. Because each of those different frameworks is built for a reason. It's to give better service to customers, or it's to drive out architectural risk early in development so that you're not, you're solving problems when they're cheaper in the delivery life cycle. But it doesn't mean that they're all fixed in stone. And I think that the shortening of timeframes, the being certain on what you're certain of and not trying to be certain on things you can't. So my favorite quote from Scott Ambler is, anytime somebody asks you for a time frame or a project plan, they're asking you to lie to them. You're going to be lying to them about the schedule, the scope, the quality, or the cost, and you might not, or all four, and you might not know which you're lying to them about, but you're definitely lying. And if you can shorten your time horizons, you can reduce the chances of your lies being lies or the impact of those lies. And I think that when you apply some of those big practices, you're just increasing the number of lies you're telling people.
I think there's another thing as well with things like waterfall and agile working together and being compatible. There are many organizations that do, and they do coexist. And in fact, a lot of scaled approaches that we have out there are actually demonstrating how those sort of governance concepts can coexist with agile ways of working. I guess the question is, why do you need them to coexist? And a lot of it comes down to the organizational maturity. You've still got people that are budgeting on annual budgets. So those budgets aren't working in an agile, iterative, incremental way. You've got policies and procedures that require metrics and reporting to be done in certain timeframes in order to get budgets. So it's the governance around the organization that's forcing that, those sort of approaches for waterfall approaches to coexist with agile. However, saying that, I work a lot in the public sector, and you can't change everything. It's like trying to change an oil tanker or turn it around, and it's a very, very slow thing. So we've had to allow them to coexist, and there are ways where you can have happy agile teams coexisting, working in a governance framework which is pretty waterfall.
Yeah. I suppose it's about doing it consciously and deliberately, and having the conscious discussions about how it will coexist. I remember someone I used to work with had this phrase which I thought described these things really well. They were like, there's this governance that we've got to do, but we should do intelligent application of the governance. And I've that's always stuck with me. It's like, it's not this dogmatic checkbox thing. It's there for a reason. And if we have an intelligent application, and the same way as intelligent application of any agile method, not just doing it because it's there. So actually that neatly brings us on to another question, which is perhaps at the other end of the sort of agile spectrum. But Mark asks, how can you prevent an agile team from living on the change edge and introducing risks by not having a consolidated view of what we've built? And this is, I suppose, also, I saw somewhere in the chat, someone was asking about, like, how do you make sure that it's, whatever you're building is coherent, that it's got some sort of vision behind it? So how would you respond to those questions?
That's a really good question. And the other thing we see a lot is teams that go too far towards the autonomy.
We've got a dog here, sorry, that's
no problem,
trying to bother us.
too far towards the high autonomy. And if you've got lots of teams, especially if you're within a big organization, you've got lots of teams and they're all being very autonomous, then they can be treading on each other's toes, they can be duplicating things, they can be choosing competing technologies. And one of the ways to avoid that is to get back to the principles and the kind of core beliefs of your organization, and to set aside kind of principles that you want to apply. So Spotify have done this quite nicely, where they have autonomous teams, but they have some ground rules. So one of the ground rules is, if you're going to make an architecturally significant decision, that's fine, you're empowered to do that. But when you do that, make sure you go and talk to some other architects, not ask their permission, not get their sign off, just ask their opinion and take that on board. And forcing those communications to happen, that collaboration to happen without delegating authority elsewhere is a really powerful way to make sure your architectures and your designs stay coherent. But it's a hard thing for the architect sometimes because they're used to being in a position where they decide an architecture and hand it down. So they've got to behave a bit differently too. But it's a really powerful way of balancing that alignment with the corporate architecture or strategy with the autonomy and empowerment within your teams.
I think there's another angle to that as well, which is ensuring that the teams actually understand what they're trying to achieve and how it aligns to the strategic goals. So if they're, it's context is everything, isn't it? And I think it's really important that they understand the context of that. They're not just performing tasks. They're not just putting bricks on and building a wall. They're actually contributing to building a beautiful castle, and it's that concept of they understand that the work that they do and the work that their team does is important, is valued in the wider context of that strategy and what they're trying to achieve, and they can understand that. And I think if they really understand, they're probably going to ask the right questions. It's when the teams lose sight of those things that they start to create their own products and they start to have their own roadmaps, and they lose sight of what they're trying to build in totality.
Yeah, that whole perspective thing of understand you're building a castle is so important, isn't it? And although there's a technique that in some ways is considered a bit old hat, but it's funny, isn't it? Like when you look at some techniques that you don't see very much anymore. It's like I always think a good context diagram can really help. And I know they're considered old hat, but I draw them all the time. And it's like, well, no, but I can sort now I see what we're trying to actually aim for, and things like.
But they're quite agile. If you think about it, the idea of working collaboratively on a whiteboard and drawing a very simple context diagram, which has got just enough information on for everyone to have the right level of understanding, and that can evolve and you can come back to it and have a conversation around it, is incredibly agile. What isn't agile is somebody in a darkened room going away and creating 2,500 diagrams and coming back and then saying, right, I've done all the thinking for you, now you go and do it. That's not very agile.
It's the collaboration.
Yeah.
Collaboration. So I want to move on to a slightly different topic, because one of the many things I really liked about the book was the anti-patterns or the red flags. I know this is something we've spoken about over the years many times, and actually this ties in quite nicely with something Divya asks in the Q&A, which is many organizations claim they are agile. Is there a checklist or reality check that can make organizations aware if they really are agile or not? And it strikes me that there may or may not be one of those, but certainly the anti-patterns are perhaps a way that indicate that you're not really agile. So I was wondering what your view on that is. Is there some sort of sense check? And I wondered if you could share just a couple of those anti-patterns to look out for.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, a bit related to that question, actually. One of them is where, I'm not even sure it's in the book because there's so many of them, but it's one that we've seen quite a lot. I'm seeing it actually with the client I'm working with just now, where the organization is dead set they want to be agile, except the people that don't need to change are the leaders or the top level. And that's a really strong anti-pattern, because if they were already behaving in an agile way as leaders, then the organization would be far down the path of being agile by default. The fact the organization isn't says their leadership ought to be changing. So one of the biggest anti-patterns is when somebody asking for an agile transformation does not also ask, how can they help? How can they change? What can they do differently? Ask for coaching, thinking about the things they're imposing on their teams and whether they're being agile. So that's one that I think we see a lot, where it's the kind of I don't need to change, but you do anti-pattern.
Yeah, and that often creates. I've got another friend. I don't know if he's on here actually, Julian Holmes, and he works in ThoughtWorks, and he always refers to that as the frozen middle. And it's so true. You get this frozen level of middle management that think that everything's got to change but them. And actually, it's generally if they start to change, then everything will change above and below them because they've got a lot of influence. So that's an interesting one. There's
a nice BA one actually that I was going to pick up. So it's don't talk for the customer.
Oh gosh, yeah, this is a big.
When you have a chain of communications between the people that need the information, which is the team delivering the value, whether that's a software team or an HR team or a finance team, if they can't talk directly to the customer, but instead they're talking to a BA or a product owner who themselves is talking to the customer. That's quite a strong anti-pattern, because in any communication, there's going to be miscommunication.
Yes.
And apart from anything else, you want to connect the team to the end customer because it makes them feel more connected to the overarching value. So that's one that as BAs, it's keen to be wary of. It doesn't mean you don't have a role, but it means you need to probably bring the team more into those conversations, or at least some of them.
I think a lot of this comes down to people having role titles as well. We already had the conversation, are there BAs in Agile? And I think sometimes people get so fixated on the role title, they create jobs for themselves around that role title, rather than thinking about what jobs need to be done to achieve the outcome. So that's sort of a little anti-pattern in there. I think big backlogs. I know myself, when I'm going in and coaching teams, there's a couple of things I look at for anti-patterns. One is I go to a retrospective, and I look at, what is usually the retrospective is a moan fest. That doesn't say a lot about the maturity and the trust within the team if it's just a moan fest. So you can learn a lot about the retrospectives, but big backlogs.
Yeah.
So huge backlogs, and another, because obviously huge backlogs lend themselves towards that upfront approach. That people then start contractually saying we've got to just plow through these, and they lose sight of what they're trying to do. But also they're not adapting it or evolving it to the changing environment of which they're developing it in. And I think that's one of the things. And another really bugbear of mine, sorry, I will let you speak in a moment. It's just that we're on the requirements thing. It is a bugbear of mine, is backlog stories that are technical tasks and not value stories.
I could yarn on about that.
Yeah, I'll leave it there, Adrian, because I'm sure that'd be a webinar in its own right.
I'm 100%, and not everyone agrees with that, but I take the view. I always take the view. Could someone from the business understand it and sign off? Will they know whether it's done? No. Well, then it's not a story. I mean, it's just they don't care about. But
I saw a brilliant one where the estimate was 750 man days for this epic. I said it was incomprehensible. It was all jargon, and the question I asked, that exact same question, is if you gave that to the CTO or the CEO, would he or she recognize that they wanted to pay for that thing? And I guarantee they wouldn't, because they would have no idea what it was.
So, which leads to probably another anti-pattern. Oh, we're getting good here, aren't we? which is but I've got to have a product backlog item because I need the story points, because we need the velocity, because someone's hammering me. It's like, and I remember hearing someone say, well, if you want me to double velocity, I can do it tomorrow. We'll just double all our estimates. I mean, it's just, it becomes a bit of a joke, doesn't it? It's like,
we have one in there called chasing metrics.
Yeah.
And you can, if you put too many metrics on teams, you actually drive the wrong behavior. So if you're going to start measuring bugs, then you're going to start creating bugs because you want to measure that you've solved them. So the team will start gaming how to manage the metrics that the managers want, and you start driving the wrong behavior from the team, not the right behavior. So you've really got to be careful on those metric things.
Absolutely. I just want to bring in a question from David here, because you were mentioning earlier about people getting caught up with the title and almost wanting to create the work because they're there to sort of almost justify the role being there. And David makes a really interesting observation / question. And he says, isn't Agile about being multi-skilled rather than just adopting to type? So, for example, testers don't only just test. A team member knows how to elicit and document requirements, might even know how to write code and perform testing, or I suppose any combination of those things. So would you advocate that sort of multi-skilling as well? Definitely.
And, there's actually a section in the book on it. We talk about T-shaped professionals and generalizing specialists. And actually use an example very similar to one that David mentioned, where you have people that can only do a particular skill or only want to do that skill, then a number of things happen. One of them is that they find the next thing that they can do on the backlog that matches their skill, which means the things above it, which are higher priority, don't get done. Or they end up doing work further out because it needs to be done eventually and they think they'll do it, and that's all work that's in advance. Or they start getting really disheartened and they feel disillusioned and disempowered, disengaged. So there's something about helping people want to be helping the whole team, and that's that connection with the goal again, and people's being clear on the value they're bringing to the customer and to the team, knowing that there'll be plenty of work for them as a tester, maybe next sprint or later. But right now, the most valuable thing they can do is to go and talk to the customer and drive out the acceptance criteria, for example.
And I think this is where we get into the conversation of people say that there isn't this role in Scrum and there isn't this. It talks about really two roles in the team. It doesn't actually try to define what the team is. It says the team is made up of all of the people necessary with all of the skills to deliver the product. You've got to figure that one out. And if that's business analysis or change or technical, whether it's a service or whether it's a product, you have to figure out what skills you need and you need to develop them. There's nothing worse than, in fact, there's even in Lean, there's one of the 8th weights that they came up with was underutilization of skill.
Absolutely.
Right. And there's nothing more disillusioning for a person being pigeonholed and not being valued for everything you bring to the table, because they're saying that's not your job because you're the BA, you don't do that. Or that's not right. You know, nobody goes from job to job and then park all their previous knowledge and say, well, I'm not going to use my brain on all those 20 years of experience I've had up until now. I'm only going to do the things that are detailed in my job description, and that's the only thing I'm bringing to the table. Of course, that's how people get experienced, you know, and that's what empowers people as well.
Yeah, definitely. Which, again, changing topic slightly, sort of, I suppose, takes us onto the behaviours and human side, which we've talked about a little bit already. But bringing in a question from Tim here as well. Tim asks, how would you go about changing an old-fashioned, long-established IT organisation to become more agile in its mindset? And it strikes me that probably, I'm guessing what Tim is referring to there is not just the implementation of new processes, but also the adoption of a new mindset and behaviours. So, I mean, how would you even start?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we talked about it earlier a little bit. You start with the top. You know, if you want to change an organisation, then the most influential people, and that's often the leadership, but it doesn't have to be, are the people that need to demonstrate that change first, and showing that it's important, connecting people to it, helping them. If there is, for example, you know, a crisis coming, whether that's a product is becoming obsolete, or there's an end of life date or something, and the company has to change, or there's a massive upstart of competitors, you know, there might be I hesitate to use the word burning platform, especially with all the talk of oil at the moment. But, you know, if there is one of those, then it's easier to unite an organization behind it because they can see what's coming. But very often there isn't. There's a crisis that is some years down the line that we can't be certain about. And today things are going quite well with the old behaviors and the old structures and the old processes. So one way to address that, and that feels a bit like what Tim might have been suggesting, is that the leadership starts to change and they recognize that.
I'm going to throw something back at you now, Adrian, because this is something you've already said to me: bottom up, top down, and middle out. And I think that you do have to address. So Simon's absolutely right. If you don't address the top, you know, but you've also got to go from the bottom up, and you've also got to go from the middle out. I think one of the other things when we're addressing behaviour is, you're looking at people being at the heart of change, and CMC that I work for, that's our tagline. That's what we do. And I think it's really important to think about why you want to change. The problem with successful organizations is they have a tendency to look at inward rather than outward, so that they look at what they've always done, and then they perpetuate that thinking of saying, well, let's not change it because that's what made us successful. So it perpetuates it. So like Simon said, you've got to understand, why do they want to change? Can we create an awareness? Do we understand, is there an awareness of a need for changing, to do something different? Why change? If everyone's really happy and they're being successful and they think that they can carry on being successful, they don't need to innovate, then they don't need to change. If they've already said they need to change, there's got to be a reason for that change. Yeah. And having that vision around that, being really clear on what that vision is, having some clarity around the awareness of the change, and creating the vision that sits behind that, and then saying, well, do people have a desire to change? Yeah, so it's using that sort of ADCAR concepts behind the behaviour of people being at the heart of change, really. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And as you were speaking there, I was thinking about the classic Eisenhower matrix, if you're familiar with it, with the important and urgent on the scale, and it's almost like
I see some organizations, they're forever in the important and urgent quadrant. Everything's on fire, and they know they know there's stuff that's important but not urgent, but they don't do anything with it. And stuff in that quadrant has a habit of slowly creeping towards the important and urgent. And when it's there, you've got no option. There's one option, which is you've just got to do something quick and tactical. And so you're forever firefighting, and then you become like the Titanic. I mean, I know that's a crass analogy, but you're sort of, it's too late because you hit the iceberg.
They're actually harboring organizational debt. And we talk about technical debt a lot, but actually in doing that, they're accumulating organizational debt. And I know that Joseph Pelrine is on that, because I saw him say he was here. So I've been working a lot with Joseph on this sort of concept of organizational debt and what it is. And you can either start paying off the debt by making changes constantly, continuous improvement. You can restructure the organization and eliminate some of the debt, or you can not. And what happens is everything starts to slow down and grinds to a halt, and you get this growth stalemate as a result of it. It's
kind of interesting, isn't it? It kind of reminds me of like if you've got a slightly old car and you skip a service, you save some money temporarily, but you will always pay it back. You'll always end up paying it back. So that moves us nicely on to ideas of tools and techniques and concepts, because as BAs we all love a tool, a technique, a concept. I mean, Lynn, you've already mentioned ADKAR as one technique, but I wondered what if you think about tools, techniques, and what should people tuning in be Googling? What should they be looking up?
There are so many, aren't there, out there? I think I think starting with context. We said context is everything. Rather than thinking about plans, why not test out now, next, future roadmaps? So, instead of saying we're going to do this in, a time scale, just say, well, these are the things we're focusing on now. This is what will be important next, and this will be important in the future. Things in the future are big. They haven't been elaborated. They don't need to be, because we're not focusing on them yet. Things that we're looking at now are more in the detail, and that's that's how you create your backlogs from those sorts of things. So you're using that for context is really good. And then there's a whole plethora of techniques and things that you can really do to help understand how you make sure you ensure you get the best product and service for the customer, ensure that centricity, customer centricity, things like persona analysis, user research, so we're saying about don't do upfront requirements, but you still need to understand your customer. You still need to do all of those things. Why not do iterative instead of having big backlogs? Why not do incremental delivery or iterative delivery using story mapping techniques and things like that, which makes it more of a game? And I know gamification is something you're quite keen on, isn't it, to help as well?
Although I was going to say that one of the things we tried to do in the book is provide an introduction to lots of other things and other materials. So the book in itself stands alone as a valuable resource, but it also gives you an insight into lots of other things that you might want to go and buy different books for. So I mean, Lynn just mentioned story mapping. That's a great example. So we've put a little bit about story mapping in, but go and buy the book. That's a really useful technique, and especially in Agile settings where you can map out years worth of work, lots of years, but in a relatively simple way, in a way that does put light detail on the further things that are further out, and that allows you to say, I haven't forgotten about it. So it's a great stakeholder management technique where you can say, don't worry, your thing you want is there, it's on the map, but it's just not happening right now. So I think there's a lot of extension reading and research and experience that people can get, but we've tried to cover quite a lot of examples, and some really simple like the 9x later. Another nice one, which we kind of touched on a bit earlier, is spheres of influence. Even just sitting down, and this comes back to your kind of, how do I influence a large transformation? Start with where you are. Think about maybe using context map. What can I control? Then think about what can I not control, but I have influence over. And then things beyond that, you can have neither control nor influence. Now, you might be able to move your sphere of influence or sphere of control out a little bit, or you might be able to bring things into them. But if it's outside your sphere of influence, then don't worry about it. Don't bring it up in retrospectives unless you've got a path to escalate it. Deal with the things you can control, and then use that as the exemplar to grow that influence wider, bring other organizations in, bring other teams in to show them what you're doing and grow out that way. And that's a really simple tool. It's two circles.
Yeah, yeah, really powerful. Or it strikes me, or find an ally that's got a sphere of influence in the area that you need to get the change progressed in.
Yeah, use your network, collaborate.
I think it's important as well, not to be a slave to tooling. That is an anti-pattern that we did talk about. But I see too many development teams just focusing on a particular tool.
We won't name it.
We won't name it. But, they focus on the tool and they try to populate every element of the tool. They become a slave to the tool and they can't step back. And then they think because they've got everything and all that detail in the tool, their job is done. And actually they're not looking at it. So there's so many tools and techniques out there. Find the ones that are best suited to the customer you're working with, the team that you're working with, that you've got the experience that you can use and all of those things, and make the best job. You don't need to be a slave to tools. I think sometimes it hinders that.
It really can. If they're configured badly, they almost act as a bottleneck to the flow of work, because everyone's so worried about whether certain fields are in the right state or whatever. And it's interesting because I don't know if you find this, but I find sometimes it also drives that other anti-pattern of the metrics, because the reason the field's got to be in a certain state is because someone's measuring the percentage that are in that state. So you end up with this mini industry and updating tickets on this platform type of thing.
Well, this is output over outcome, isn't it?
Yes.
If we actually focused on the outcome, what the value is that's being delivered, that's the only real metric. And not only just what's being delivered, it's how value is it in use.
Yeah.
We talk about value in use. You can measure all of these other things, but actually they don't mean anything. The only real value is how valuable is it once it's being used by a customer.
And the easiest way to measure your best two leading indicators of value are your customers happy with what you're doing, and are your team happy with their work. If those two things are good, you're probably doing good work.
Yeah.
If they're not good, that's where you start. Don't worry about velocity. In fact, definitely don't measure that unless the team's doing it for themselves. But all the other metrics are secondary to happy customers, happy teams.
Absolutely. That's a really, really powerful message there, Simon, because it's often lost, isn't it? And there are things that almost, because the tool measures it out of the box, it gets measured. And actually going back to those important principles of actually, are we doing the right thing and doing it in a way that our people are enjoying? I mean, that's, so simple, but so important.
I like what Wouter just said on that as well, that you should define the process first and then make the tool fit to that. So many become a slave the other way. So yes, totally agree with that.
Absolutely. Okay, let's take a few more questions. And in fact, the first question, ironically, is from Wouter, who asks, what is the best place for a BA in an Agile team, in your view?
I don't think I'll be completely honest here. I don't believe there is a full-time role for a full-time BA in an Agile development team. So I think traveling BAs are probably better. And when I've worked with multiple development teams, I think the concept of traveling BAs works much better, because the BAs then can really concentrate on the roadmap, the strategy for what they're trying to do, keeping that connected with the development team, facilitating the conversations with the development team, not getting in the way, not being the gatekeeper, providing that context. And helping elaborate some of the understanding so that the developers can ask the questions around that at the time they need to, and not be distracted from that elaboration while they're trying to get on with delivering the stuff at that time. I don't believe there is a role directly for them to have a one-to-one mapping within a development, because there's not enough work for them to do, unless they're completely multi-skilled and then they're just a member of the development team. So
yeah, I think the other place that they can have huge value, especially where you've got, as we talked a little bit earlier, where you've got, I'm going to say, unskilled product owners or product managers, so people who are in a product owner role or a product manager role, and they either don't have the skill, the experience, or often the time to do that role really well. I think BAs can provide a really good supporting role to them, as long as you steer clear of that other anti-pattern, which is making the customer's decisions for them.
Yeah.
You can offer suggestions, you can say, here's some options, but the product owner who's representing the business needs to be making the final decision. But there's a really good role for BAs in that space, I think.
Yeah, I think being the conscience as well. I think some of the roles, I've always talked about myself being the equivalent of Jiminy Cricket sitting on the shoulder of the project manager or the product owner, being their conscience. You're asking the questions and bringing in, because you're, as a BA, you're having lots of conversations with end users and development teams and things like that, and you get quite a broad understanding. So you've got to play that conscience back to make sure that people are making informed decisions.
It's really interesting. So I love that idea of being the conscience and asking the provocative questions sometimes, the questions that everyone's thinking but nobody's really saying. And actually, Simon, you mentioned the PO or the product owner or product manager. That leads on quite nicely to a question that Gwen's asked, which is what is the role of the product owner versus the business analyst? And I know this is quite a hot topic in many organizations.
Well, I think it's back to that kind of customer centricity and representing the business and being the person that literally owns the product. It is their product. They're responsible for what it does, why it does it, who's using it. The BA role can be putting a lot of clarity on that. They can be making it clear. They can be making sure it's unambiguous. They can be helping make sure that the acceptance criteria are correct, but they shouldn't be ultimately deciding for the business what the business needs. They can help expose to the business what they might need. They can make suggestions. They can facilitate workshops that bring the business to the realization that they need this thing or that thing. But ultimately, the product owner is representing the business. And one of the other anti-patterns is when the product owner becomes, too much part of the development team and loses touch with the business.
Yeah, I think the main difference is responsibility. The product owner has responsibility. BA hasn't got responsibility for prioritizing the backlog. And so the skill sets that they can have can be very, very similar. I think somebody with BA skills would make a very good product owner, providing they can speak on behalf of the customer, and the customer wants them to speak on behalf of it, and they know and understand the customer's viewpoint.
That's it, isn't it? It's about the accountability and having the legitimate authority to make the call. Because I suppose that's possibly another anti-pattern, is where you've got like a proxy product owner who makes decisions, but then they're overridden in 3 weeks' time by the real PO who hasn't properly delegated their authority and
or worse, 6 months later.
Yeah. Oh wow, that would be painful. That would be painful. Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a really interesting question from Rushma, who says that I'm working for an organization adopting Agile. I'm producing user stories in DevOps. So I'm presuming that's the Microsoft Azure DevOps suite, and not in documents. However, management wants sight of the requirements, yet do not want to use DevOps. Which any suggestions?
I'd wonder why they want sight of the requirements at that level.
That's right.
That's a great question to ask them, is why. The other thing is probably the answer is they don't want to see the requirements at that level. They probably want to see something a bit higher up, maybe some roadmap items, maybe higher level features or capabilities.
Well, they're not seeing output.
Yeah. So the reason for that question, and that's the thing to get to the bottom of, probably they want to see what they will get value from is higher level. So there's a really great quote, we use it a couple of times in the book, by Field Marshal General von Moltke, who was a German field marshal in the 1900s, and he describes an order as being all, but also only, what the soldier cannot determine for themselves. And that's what the leaders should be interested in. They should be interested in giving you all that you need, but nothing that you don't need. If you can work it out for yourself, let the team work it out for themselves. And that's the level at which your leaders should be concentrating. And if they need to get into Azure DevOps, probably they're trying to micromanage you.
It's interesting, and actually a technique that was mentioned earlier, which perhaps might be useful in that context. I was thinking like the top bit of a story map, for example, might be something to show them. And I know there are add-ons for DevOps that can provide a sort of story map view, so that might be something to investigate, Rushma. But right, we've got just a few minutes left, so I'm going to do like quick fire questions now. So this is where I give you the impossible task of answering questions quickly. And the first one is, Jason asks, what do you believe the major anti-patterns in Agile inception and discovery? Wow, that's a good question.
Too much work up front.
So too much work.
And not enough collaboration.
So too much work, not enough collaboration. Excellent. And then Tim asks, to what extent can you apply the Agile approach and mindset to the implementation of a COTS, so commercial off-the-shelf solutions, for example, new HR and payroll system?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think you can. If what you're doing is delivering change of some kind, then that amounts to a epic or a story. So you can still break that down.
I think also you can introduce the product incrementally.
Yeah.
Even if you've bought the whole thing, you don't need to introduce all the elements, all the packages to the workforce at the same time. So you can do a little slice of value with the new product while they still use the old one.
Yeah, minimum viable.
Absolutely, absolutely, and figure out which bits of it need configuration and how that gets sort of.
The other thing with HR problems is very often there's quite a lot you can do within the existing policies and processes that deliver quite a lot of change. So you don't necessarily need to make policy change across an organization to test out new policy ideas, because very often the existing policies are actually quite flexible.
Absolutely, absolutely, fantastic. Well, we'll start to sort of draw the session to a conclusion. And apologies, there's a few questions that we couldn't quite get to. So apologies if we couldn't get to your question. A question I did want to ask you is around resources. So clearly, as everyone will have seen, this bit of product placement in the blatant product placement in the background here. But one resource is of course Lynn and Simon's excellent book Agile from First Principles, which is it's fresh off the press, but a few weeks old. Published by BCS, so definitely I'd recommend everyone to get a hold of a copy of this. Walter's question, when your dog appeared in the frame, said, why was a different dog on the cover, which I thought was a great question as well.
Frank's very upset about that.
Yeah. So other than your book, what other resources, whether that's blogs, whether it's whatever, what would you recommend people tune into?
The internet's an interesting one. There's lots of really great stuff, and there's lots of really poor advice as well, and lots of plain wrong advice. So I'd be cautious a little bit about the website. I can't recall a good website that I would hand on heart recommend. But in terms of the books, there's a couple that I keep coming back to. On the leadership one, it's definitely David Marquet, Turn the Ship Around.
Yes.
For all sorts of reasons, but mainly because it shows that in a really unusual, highly, you'd think, constrained environment of a nuclear submarine, you can still apply really strong Agile concepts. Although he doesn't talk about Agile, he hasn't read the manifesto when he did those things. So that's from leadership side is one of my top tips.
I've got a whole load. I mean, from a leadership point as well, I think Amy Edmondson's Fearless Organization is really good on things like psychological safety. I think.
My turn.
Go on. Then you go.
So the next one on the kind of practicalities of implementing a framework like Scrum, Henrik Nyberg, Scrum and XP from the Trenches is brilliant. What's really nice about it is there's 2 editions. The second edition is a director's cut where he goes through the first edition and corrects it, and he says things like, "I have no idea why I thought that. That's rubbish advice. Don't do that." So he's even showing that iterative and incremental improvements, but he's doing it transparently and out loud. It's a quite short book, but it's a really, really powerful one.
Sorry, Lynn, go ahead.
I was going to say, we've already mentioned it, but Jeff Patton's story mapping is a really good one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really accessible, nice sort of book read as well, practical.
And then from a coaching perspective, Liz Atkins, Coaching Agile Teams is full of really great advice and practical guidance.
And another one that I think, if you want to look slightly wider, I think this is my last one as well, but it's a favorite of mine and was recommended to me by Joseph Pellerine, is Fast Strategy. And it's how strategic agility will help you stay ahead of the game, by a guy called Yves Doss. So look that one up. It's really about how do you apply agility mindset to things like strategy, which is that wider piece, isn't it?
Absolutely, and excellent. Thank you. And I see Rushma's putting some links to the books in the chat as we speak. You can always rely on Rushma. Thank you for doing that. So my final question to both of you, Simon and Lynn, is your biggest takeaway. So if you think about the people tuning in who are either tuning in live or watching the recording, what would your biggest takeaway from this session be for them?
I'll go first then. So I think there's a couple of things. The main one is get the basics right. If you get the basics wrong, it doesn't matter what framework you apply on top, you'll get poor results. So focus on the basics and get them right. And I think related to that, the Agile Manifesto's got two parts, the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And everybody talks about how the right-hand side is still important. Even the manifesto says, we value the things on the left more. The things on the right, we already do by default. And if you just if you don't try to force yourself to the left, you will get dragged to the right. And there's lots of examples in the book about that. So be aware that society, history, the way education's set up, the culture within organizations are all dragging you to the right-hand side of the manifesto. So bear that in mind and try to get the basics right. And that's the best foundation to start from. And it's hard.
And another takeaway, Agile isn't a set of processes and tools, it's about mindset and behavior. I think Agile would be really easy if people weren't involved. But people come with their own behaviors and characteristics and values. And so, focus on people. If you want to, and think about what you're trying to change and how that change affects them. Be compassionate as well about that change.
Mostly people are trying hard.
Yeah, and I think something we would have mentioned earlier. Assume noble intent.
Until proven otherwise.
Yeah, people try to do the right thing. People don't go out to have a bad day.
Yeah. No one really. I remember hearing someone saying, perhaps it was either you, Simon, or Lynn. I remember someone saying, no one goes into work and thinks, how can I royally muck things up today? Few people. Maybe there's one or two.
Maybe there's a few on the edge.
and yet, what we see in a lot of HR processes is processes that have assumed that 99% of people have that mindset, where in reality it's the other way around, and yet the 100% are all affected by those same constraints and rules.
There's a really great phrase for that. Don't put everyone in prison because there's a few criminals that get amongst us.
Isn't that interesting when you look at all the approvals and multi-layers of assuming? Almost it's that whole that whole almost stereotypical 1900s factory mentality that's still with us today. So but that could be a whole nother webinar. So
we talk about that in the leadership chapter, and we give the example of the expenses policies. Most of your expense policy is probably quite a lot of pages. It will probably have ceiling limits for hotels. Netflix's expenses policy is 5 words: act in Netflix's best interest. You couple that with transparency so people can see what you're doing, but you don't need a lot of rules if you've got a well-led organization.
Absolutely, which comes back to principles and having a sort of, a strong ethical code as well. Fantastic. Well, Simon, Lynn, we could talk about this for hours as we do sometimes when we get the chance to get together. So, thank you so much for taking the time to come and answer questions and speak here today. I'm absolutely sure that people will want to connect with you. They'll want to stay in touch. Of course, they'll want to get hold of the book. The book's available on Amazon and, of course, on BCS. And I believe if you're a BCS member, there's a discount if you buy it from BCS. That might be a good way of getting it. How's the best way for people to stay in touch? Should they connect with you on LinkedIn or? Yeah.
LinkedIn works for us.
Yeah, it says Linda Girvan on LinkedIn. So find out me there, and always happy to help. And the other thing is both Simon and I are both Agile coaches. So if you think you need coaching in your organisation or any support like that, then please do let us know as well.
Definitely.
Fantastic. And this is where if it was a real event, there'd be a very warm round of applause now. Because it's a virtual event, there won't be. However, if you're tuning in live or even if you're watching the recording, if you found this useful, what I would say is do connect with Simon and Lynn. It's like a virtual round of applause because it's a way of letting them know that you found it useful. So I've put your LinkedIn profile IDs in the chat, so do connect with them there. Just before we close the webinar, I just want to let everyone know about the next webinar, which is entitled "What Does a Cybersecurity BA Actually Do?" It's an interactive Q&A format in exactly this sort of format with Kevin Brennan, who's someone that I'm sure many, if not all of you will know. And that's on the 12th of July at 6:30 UK time. 6:30 UK time is 1:30 Eastern time. It is 7:30 Central European time and 8:30 Eastern European time, I think, but check that because I'm notoriously bad with time zones. So the link to that is in the chat there. So please do go ahead and register if you would like to attend that one as well. So all that's left for me to say again is thank you to everyone for tuning in live or indeed watching the recording. Do remember, get your hands on Lynn and Simon's book. And thank you again, Lynn and Simon. I can't wait until we get the opportunity to chat again.
It's been really great. Thank you very much. And great questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks everyone. Bye. Bye.